Welcome, everybody. 52 Living Ideas is delighted and honored to have Mark Stallman and the Center for the Study of Digital Life back. This is the fourth series that Mark and CSDL is doing for us. It started with faculty psychology. We did 3 spheres. We did Catholic social teaching. Now, but this is the one that I'm very, very excited about because this is the launch of TrivU. So with that, let me hand it over to Mark.
Thank you, Shrikant. In fact, I can't thank you enough for all the assistance that you've given us throughout all of this. Welcome, everybody. This is the beginning of an experiment that I trust will go on for many years. And so you really are here at the very, very beginning. This experimental online school, Trivium University, has a very unique curriculum. It has plans that are quite unlike anything else that I'm aware of, and that's why it's an experiment. So we're not following any of the usual curricular approaches, but we do have, fortunately, Fred Beitler, who will be joining us shortly, and he really is my partner in this entire exercise. This is a project of the Center for the Study of Digital Life, as Shrikant has said, and both Fred and Douglas Rushkoff and Milo Jones and many others who you will hear from in this are all, and Fred, Bill Freza and so forth. These are all fellows at the center. So if you go to digitallife.center, you will see what we're up to and hopefully be able to check out the backgrounds of the people here. I also want to very much thank Britt Harris and Chris Perry. Britt Harris runs a program called the Titans of Investment and was very kind to invite me to come and speak in front of them a week or two ago, and has forwarded our plans to the entire group. He's been doing it for 17 years, has 800 plus graduates of the program. He is a brilliant and well recognized because he runs a very big fund out of Texas. And also Chris Perry, who is the chairman of Futures at Weber Shandwick. These are both people who have been enormously helpful in all of this, and so I want to thank them up front. Fred and I are part of a much larger team, and so you will be introduced to other members of this team along the way. Good to see Jeff Martineau has joined us. Jeff's been familiar with these efforts for a long time, and he's got a smile on his face because I'm sure he's pleased to see where this is headed. We're also launching a newsletter, I should note for you. It's called the 3 Spheres Newsletter, or shortened TSN. That will be geopolitics under digital conditions, and so some of the same people will be involved with that effort. And so there's a very big push at the center. This is in some ways our post-COVID breakout. And I hope that all of you find a way to participate, be involved with this. We have a mailing list. We're actually an online list called TrivU at Topic Box. And so for those of you who'd like to participate in that, I will be posting commentaries we have in the past on Slack in a variety of ways to keep the conversation going between these discussions. But let's try to see if we can do it on the TrivU list at this point. Let's look at the slides now. So as you can see, this is the first of 4 lectures. We will be doing this next week, then we'll skip a week, then we'll do 2 more weeks. The details of this will unfold. I have already posted these slides, in fact, to the mailing list. And so we're going to try to be able to update you as we head into these lectures. We have an enormous amount of material to cover, and there really isn't enough time to do that. So this is meant really as just a taste, or if you will, a promotion for what we will be doing next year as we launch the actual university. But you'll get a good view of many of the topics and the uniqueness of our approach to those topics after that. Next slide, please. So here we are. Everybody here has their own take, no doubt, on how we got into this situation. I doubt that anybody has showed up for this lecture who isn't aware that we're in a crisis. This is not a crisis that is caused by global warming. This is not a crisis that is caused, as previous crises have been, ascribed to overpopulation, et cetera, et cetera. This is a crisis that has been caused by technology. In particular, we are in a paradigm transition here. And I will be talking about this more on the next slide, and then we're going to actually have an entire lecture session on navigating the paradigms. But postmodernism, as I'm sure many of you have heard about, maybe even studied, sliced and diced our lives so that we became fragmented and very distant from each other, and lost track of what the postmoderns called grand narratives. That's been replaced by something even more extreme, if you will. Posthumanism has now become the academic trend, and it ascribes to humans, specifically using Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, as oppressors and exploiters of nature. Nothing could be worse than that. And so human beings have been downgraded remarkably over the course of the past couple of decades. On top of that, as many of you know, the notion that we have to leave Earth and start over again has actually become a serious endgame. That is to say, people with enough money to throw things very high up into the sky, with plans, particularly first as a stepping stone, the moon, and then to Mars. So when you hear about these projects and so forth, and how glorious they are, you have to recall that human beings cannot live on Mars. In fact, if we're going to go to Mars, it won't be humans as we know them. It'll have to be some sort of a hybrid, perhaps even all the way beyond cyborg to android. So this is a context in which we've all been saturated with fantasy. This fantasy took over, and as we all know in so many different dimensions, the pre-literate has been valorized under these circumstances. We lost, crucially, our image of the future. And so one of the things I'm going to be doing on the mailing list will be bibliographies and so forth. And so image of the future is a very important stepping stone in the process of getting us to where we are now. We've really lost our telos, or our purpose. Today, I won't repeat this in the other lectures, but today I'm just going to reveal a little bit about my own sensibility by identifying some songs. And when I went and looked at these songs, they turn out all to be roughly 1989. So I guess I was paying attention in 1989 in a way that I wasn't. But the reason why I'm doing this is to invite you to participate, particularly on the TrivU list, artists who are more representative, perhaps, of this transition to digital. So the song that I would highlight for you, and this is older than probably most people here are alive, was the Buffalo Springfield 1967, For What It's Worth, where the lyric begins, as you recall, there's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. I'll also have songs for each of the other 4 slides here. So that little device I will abandon after today, but I will put that on the TrivU list. We have forgotten about causality. Causality was actually expunged largely in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. The remainder, that is to say, of Aristotle's 4 causes, not much was left, and replaced by statistics, because you cannot do social science if you're trying to, in fact, engineer humans without statistics. So this shift to statistics is one of the fundamental problems we're going to have to deal with. Television is the environment that we have come out of. That environment is no longer forceful. It, in fact, has been replaced by a digital environment. But we were asked to suspend, and the way this is normally given, of course, is suspend our disbeliefs. But in fact, what television did to us was it asked us to suspend our beliefs. The meaning of life winds up being a very vital question once again. This is not something that can be resolved with robots, with artificial intelligence. In fact, the distinction between live things and dead things is very important. Next slide, please. I don't know if you're familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer. Edelman is a large PR firm that for 20 years now has been doing a trust barometer. And it just completely has continued to crater. We're now at the point, as the headline for the 2022 Trust Barometer, that nearly 50% of the respondents view both government and media as divisive forces in society. Now, as you know, when you take polls, the words you use really matter. So I'm not quite sure what divisive would mean, but it's negative. And so to have half the population actually just coming to the conclusion here that things are really messed up leads me to the song for this slide, which is Bob Dylan's "Everything Is Broken." And that's a 1989 song. I will actually put the playlist and links to it on the TrivU list. As we all know, misinformation, disinformation, neither of which have definitions, that, of course, they can't. They're meant to be political weapons. So we have politicized information, weaponized it in a way that very few people have ever experienced. This is quite different from propaganda in the past. It's quite different even from memes. It has a desperation. It has a kind of end of the world. It has a kind of Armageddon dimension to it. And this polarization has, of course, led to widespread fears of a collapse of democracy, which is also never defined. Needless to say, the United States of America is not a democracy, it's a constitutional republic, but leaving such fine points aside, the notion that elections are no longer viable, the notion that civil war may be on the horizon is extremely widespread. As you know, and the Edelman Trust Barometer, blaming both government and media for this situation should not be a surprise. The idea that we can run and hide, the idea that we can somehow disappear into a gulch, that we could somehow get ourselves into a situation where we will have liberty in cryptocurrency. Of course, no one believes that anymore. If you have followed Bitcoin, you followed Ethereum, followed any of these crypto systems, you'll know that they can be hacked. And so the safety of your currency in this really doesn't matter about fiat currency. It's far worse than that. The collapse of advertising effectiveness does not get enough attention. I'll return to this last bullet point here, but the population has already gone through such a shift that the expectation that you can do public relations no longer holds. In this process, expertise, such as it was, has largely been replaced, as you would expect, by ideology and identity and various sorts of groupings. This is the sort of experience that you'd expect if there were a well-written history and you collapsed long time periods into short time periods. This is what paradigm shifts do to us. The fact that today's institutions, including, of course, corporations, NGOs, churches, governments, other authorities, can be turned to, has largely dissolved. The institutions are suspect, and they're very often abandoned. It is this abandonment of institutions that I think may be particularly interesting. Some of the folks that we've been working with have quite aggressively pushed off in this direction. And so the notion of distributed autonomous organization, DAOs, has gotten itself all the way to Qatar and Dubai and Mongolia. And this is a theme that we'll pick up in Three Spheres newsletter, TSN, but you will not understand what is happening around the world. This is not just a local phenomenon by any means. You'll understand much better what is happening around the world when we launch TSN. Here I want to highlight something that is particularly important. We're all familiar with the notion of generation gaps and so forth, but empirically, what seems to have happened, as identified by those who have been careful to look at this, is that there's already, we don't have to wait for these things to happen. There's already a sharp break between the attitudes of Gen Z. Remember, the way this worked was Gen X, Gen Y, it got called millennial, Gen Z, and we're now actually already into Gen A. These are labels that are done by the advertising and PR worlds as cohorts. But the surprising effect here is that those who were born between 97 and 2012, who have been correctly called the first digital generation, have a much different approach than their earlier millennials and Gen X. We will find a great deal more about this as we get into Trivium University, because we're going to be across all of these age groups, and we're going to find out a lot more about how this both breaks out and how it's likely to develop. Next slide, please. Has Fred joined us yet?
No, not yet.
Okay. Well, Fred is the professional educator between us. I'm a retired Wall Street analyst. Fred has recently stepped down as the Associate Dean of Liberal Arts at the Graham School, University of Chicago. And so Fred and I were going to ping pong this slide. Don't worry, we'll get a chance to hear from Fred. He's Dean of Trivium University, so he'll be very much in our awareness. But the song that I'm going to cite for this particular slide is one of my all-time favorites. I must confess, given my background, that blues and R&B are sort of the way I grew up in the music business. Not a rock and roll person quite so much. And so there was a group called Soul to Soul, a British R&B group. And again, in 1989, they released and actually got charted with a song that has the name Get a Life. The subtitle for that is Meaning of Life. And so, again, you'll see this in the TrivU list, but it very well identifies, going back quite a ways now, because this transition that we're now in was certainly beginning in the 90s. The transition from television as a paradigm to digital as a paradigm is not something we're talking about might happen in the future. This is not something that we're forecasting or projecting. In fact, we are 20 to 30 years already into this, which might give some credence to some of the songs I've identified here as reflecting the notion of artists as the antenna of the race, an Ezra Pound statement picked up by Marcia McLuhan. The crisis in mental health, particularly in higher education, but all the way down the chain, is something that has been much written about, and I'm sure experienced by many of us as well. The statistics for depression and suicide. So I thought about going and collecting the statistics and putting up a chart and so forth, and then I decided, no, everybody kind of knows this is going on. It sort of doesn't matter what the numbers are. We know that this is on a very steep ramp. We know that a vast number of college students are getting antidepressants being handed out like candy by the college medical groups. And we know that the results have been quite disastrous in many lives. A part of the reason for this, of course, is just the ungroundedness of a paradigm shift. Your college degree probably doesn't have the value that you thought when you entered into college. In any event, there's a very wide debate, and there are a number of people who, in fact, have decided to pay people to leave college and start companies and so forth. And I was talking with a friend this morning, and he said he dropped out of his PhD program because he wanted money, understandably. But he's so glad that he did that. There are many others who are stepping away from master's degrees as well as leaving their undergraduate careers for these reasons. And a big part of this, of course, is that what would have seemed at one point to be a relatively straightforward, if you keep your nose to the grindstone, if you perform, if you build a network, your career opportunities seem to be relatively straightforward. That is no longer the case. That's become much more increasingly doubtful. So the uncertainty associated with the value of education has been really driven home and contributes certainly to the depression and other terrible effects of this breakdown. I don't need to highlight for you in any as if it's a surprise, free speech has largely been abandoned in our society. The notion that other societies are totalitarian and we are free just doesn't seem to apply anymore. And what happens as a result of that, of course, is that people stop asking the important questions. So as inquiry is sharply narrowed, we wind up in an increasingly ignorant and polarized and dangerous situation. Bill Frezza, who's with us today, has been involved with the MIT Free Speech Alliance. MIT is a very interesting place for this to occur. One of the things that he's noted to me is that until they came along, there were so many STEM-oriented faculty members who weren't even aware of what was happening at MIT. So the awareness of this in some circles is really coming home very forcefully. Science has really taken it on the chin, as it should under these circumstances. The idea that we're going to follow the science is nonsense to a vast part of the population. It's lost its public support. They may not know the details of the reproducibility crisis, but the fact of the matter is that a vast range, and it's not just social science, it turns out that there are scientific reports being funded and published, which are clearly nonsense. And so the integrity of science today has come under very significant attacks. You will see probably in the paper today more about how we should have never trusted the CDC, for instance. So if the CDC, who as internally has begun to take blame and apologize, then who exactly are we supposed to trust in terms of following the science? And the answer is, we're in a new paradigm. Therefore, we need new sciences. In other words, this is not a matter of people who have simply been trying to scoop up the money to pay for their careers. This is an environmental circumstance. A paradigm is an environment. It is a psychotechnological environment. And as we learned from the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published back in 1962, a new paradigm inherently means new sciences. And I'll give you an example. Debbie's just asked for an example in the chat, so let me give you one. Another thing which I will put into the TrivU list is a link to and a discussion of 2020, so it didn't happen just yesterday, interview with Roger Penrose. So those of you who've been interested in the massive amount of effort to try to understand consciousness. Now, obviously, the reason for all this interest in consciousness is Blade Runner. The reason for all this interest in consciousness is to see if we can build replicants, build robots that can fool us. So we have people running around now talking about the Turing tests and how we're about to, Kurzweil says, by next year, we're going to have a majority of the population who could be fooled by robots. Not surprising for Ray Kurzweil. But the sciences that Roger Penrose specifically addresses in this interview Penrose, just to remind you, is usually identified as the quantum consciousness guy. That is not fair at all. As you might expect, what happens is that really smart people get up and say somewhat controversial things, and then they get pigeonholed, they get thrown into this category or that. Penrose correctly has said quantum mechanics is basically bunk. Without the inclusion of gravity into all of this, we're dealing with something that is partial and therefore incorrect. And he then highlighted, I didn't know this particular detail, but he would. We all know about Schrodinger's cat. We all know the notion that quantum mechanics tells us that we don't know if the cat's alive or dead till we open the box. Penrose suggested, and he's a very high-ranking emeritus character who would know these people personally. He said that the reason why Schrodinger did this is because the notion that the cat might be dead, might be alive, is nonsense. That Schrodinger was in fact pointing out for us that the end result of quantum mechanics was a kind of manufactured uncertainty, a kind of a lack of awareness. And in fact, his remedy for this turns out to be something I think that we at the center may have contributed to solving, as he has identified the key area for consciousness as the in-between perception and intelligence. And so, as he correctly said, not only is consciousness not computational, so that throws out all of cognitive psychology, but he has then said, you cannot call something intelligent if they don't understand. And you can't say that somebody understands if they don't have an awareness of the situation, neither of which are a part of AI trying to build machines. Specifically, the new sciences are going to have to return to a deep understanding of causality. As I had noted before, causality has largely been abandoned and replaced with statistics in particular. And crucially, We won't have time to go into this here, but we will be teaching this in some detail at Trivium University. The whole question of forms, and in particular, the contrast between an Aristotelian form and what we call information. Information is an obscuring of the meaning of the term form. And this is going to be a very important component of the new sciences, is understanding both causality and forms. Now, we're Fred here with us. He came up with the term digital great books. That's understandable because he was, in my lingo, he would probably object to this, but he was in effect the last dean standing in the Great Books program. Great Books was a 30s, 40s program that initially came out of the University of Chicago. I'm sure all of you are familiar with it. Some of you may have even gone through a Great Books course here or there. They're largely not being taught anymore. And the reason why we're going to pick this up is because it was oriented towards a paradigm that we do not want to retrieve. It was oriented towards the print paradigm. Title, Great Books, would give that away.
Mark, Fred has just joined.
Oh, okay.
Fred.
Hello, Fred. Well, we can return to this as Fred would like to, but this final bullet point here was written specifically for Fred's comments, and so we can weave those in as it is possible. Trevor is asking questions. We will get to a Q&A, Trevor. It will be, I think, a matter of submitting questions, which I guess you're doing through chat, and then Shrikant will prioritize them, and we'll use the last 15 minutes or so. So I've been rattling on here for a while. I have one more slide to go to, and then we'll get to Q&A. The rediscovery of Aristotle turns out to be enormously important in the Digital Great Books program. So if you go back to Great Books, as it has been published by Encyclopedia Britannica, which was owned by the University of Chicago, and in particular, Mortimer Adler's Syntopicon, you will find that approach, I'm going to say, adequate to the circumstances. The circumstances in the 30s and 40s were a battle between two different paradigms: the paradigm of print, Great Books, and the paradigm of electricity, specifically as it was instantiated in radio and then later in television. So that contest between print and electric, which is a paradigmatic conflict, no longer holds. We're in a new paradigm, therefore we're in a new conflict. And in that conflict, the rediscovery of Aristotle, which happened, by the way, in the West in the 13th century, and continued in various forms moving forward from there, will be one of the topics we'll pick up in TrivU. Next slide, please. I don't know how much all of you have had a chance to think about elites. To the extent that democracy winds up being the touchstone of so much of our conversation today, a part of what that disguises is the failure of the elites. And the way that we know the elites have failed is because they have identified their primary project as globalism. And we now know that they have admitted it's collapsed. So the elite following World War II, particularly as it surrounded various powerful families, which tend to be at the center of elites of this sort, and many institutions, it was already on the ropes in some sense in the 70s but certainly by the point that we get various people writing op-eds in the New York Times and writing books about this, and there's already a growing library about this. This isn't controversial. The rise of China has probably been the thing that has tipped people over the edge. It's been going on for this collapse of globalism has been going on for quite a while, but the evident rise of China is closely associated with the initial election of Xi Jinping as the head of the Communist Party of China. Fred is back in the waiting room. And as it turns out, we are experts on China. Oh, there he is. But with a lot of feedback. I think you need to turn your speakers on. Thank you. The rise of China is not the way you have probably come to understand it. And so a much more robust understanding of the differences in sensibility between the East and the West, and indeed the digital sphere, as we've identified it. And this will be the fourth and last lecture, by the way. So 4 weeks from today, we'll be delving into specifically the three spheres. There was supposed to be very famous Vilfredo Pareto. You probably have run into Pareto in various places in your studies. He is, among other things, typically credited with the 80-20 rule. He's also credited with various approaches to distribution, which is the same sort of thing, that small amounts actually are what affect the total overall results. But he also had a notion called the rotation of elites. So there was supposed to be a relatively orderly process where one set of elites got replaced with another set of elites, and sometimes there was conflict, and sometimes it was very messy. That has simply broken down. There is no new elite waiting in the wings. That process of rotation has broken down, and therefore it becomes all of our responsibilities to try to address this very serious issue. There is no future in elites as they have previously been constituted. I have no doubt whatsoever that that will shift again, and there will be new elites and new leadership. And it's one of the things we're hoping to contribute to at TrivU, to train some of them. I've sat around, and many of you have read Chris Perry's post on his Substack, which he titled Guardians of the Future. And that's, I think, an apt title for what we're trying to do here. Let me also note that there are very few new ideas being proposed today. There's a lot of ranting. There's a lot of people with their placards up in the air, but they typically wind up being ignorant of the technological effects which are the underlying cause of all of these shifts. So we will see many proposals that have been floated over the course of decades, again being put forward. They have failed in the past, they will fail in the future. We need new ideas. Not only do new paradigms require new sciences, but they require new leaders. And those new leaders are going to have to think differently than the previous generations. So I will note for you that the 3 remaining lectures in this 4-lecture series, and I apologize for speaking so rapidly. I apologize for trying to cram 10 pounds into a 5-pound sack, which is something that I've been credited with over the years, at least trying to do. But I hope this is a little bit of a taste. The new paradigms are going to, in fact, need to come to grips with these technological effects. They are psychological effects, they are sociological effects, and they can no longer be ignored. They are the ground, if you will. This may be a good point to bring Doug into the conversation. I know he wanted
Fred
to talk
is
about.
also. I think Fred is also ready. Would you like to? Would you like to?
I tell you what I'll do. I will finish on this slide, which is the last of the 4 slides that I prepared, and then why don't we set aside some time for Fred, Doug, and Milo. And so we'll let everyone, each of them, get a chance to tell us what they've been thinking about.
Perfect.
And so I'll just finish up with this: that we need very different sensibilities to move forward under these circumstances. The reality is that media shapes our behaviors and attitudes. And you will recognize in this Marshall McLuhan, who will be one of the very important figures that we'll be using. I'll also just end with, and we will amplify on this going forward, the digital environment retrieves a scribal medieval sensibility. And so this is going to require us to really have some new ways of thinking. So let me end with that. Let me hand it back to Shrikant. He has 3 other speakers who would like to talk to us a bit today. I'm sorry I've rambled on and sort of run past everybody else's tracks here, but Doug, take it away.
Go ahead, Doug. Sure. I mean, I'll just take 1 minute. Mark invited me to I guess, announce a very Center for Digital Life inspired and augmented book that I wrote called Survival of the Richest, which, and the subtitle, very appropriate for what Mark was just talking about, is Escape Fantasies of the Tech Billionaires, where fantasies is the operative word in so many ways that we don't even need to go into. But my experience with the book has been fascinating in that, basically it's a book about these, tech billionaires who on the one hand are building bunkers and rocket ships and all to escape from the rest of us, but in the other sense have an escapist cyborg. They've replaced telos with fantasy, basically. And that fantasy is very digitally inspired, and that it's, a 0 to 1, 1 level up, transubstantiated, move into the ether, a complete symbolic, and we could argue a television mentality being brought into the digital realm, completely, actually not understanding what it is at all. But as I attempted to promote and talk about this book to smart and dumb journalists alike, everybody is fascinated and fixated with the catastrophe, with the, bunkers. So how do the bunkers work? And where do I get a bunker? And how should I do a bunker? And what can I learn from the billionaires' bunkers? And how are they getting off? Nobody is getting, or not nobody, but few people are getting that what this book is about is not that figure of the catastrophe, but the ground that got us here. What is the history of this thinking? Where does it come from? How do capitalism and science and technology and domination, how do they combine to create this mindset, this way of thinking? And it was just fascinating to me, and I'm sure McLuhan and men greater than me experienced, and Wiener experienced this same thing, that you say the new thing and people are so intent on interpreting it through the old lens that they do not want to hear the new thing, which is why a new style of education, a new way of thinking, which is why the center is actually so important. We need to tenderize the meat so it can accept the knowledge. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's a different, we have to train brains and hearts and minds to engage with information and perception differently. And it was just shocking to me that I can say it so directly and still people are like, oh yeah, but how do I build my bunker? Which guy is right? And part of it is, as you're saying, there's no history. These dudes have no history. They're not. It's not just that they're plucked from college as freshmen to go build things. They have no history, no reading, a lot of fantasy. Their education is Walking Dead and at best Blade Runner. And in addition, I mean, and this is the thing that I want to bring to our discussions, in addition to an image of the future, in addition to a telos, I often get concerned that especially, you know, the tech bros, psychedelic sense making dudes whose names we don't have to remember, but have a lot of faith in their rebellious wisdom. They have something like telos, which is not, and very easily confused with telos. They have an omega point that they get from Desjardins, or an emergent fractal chaos attractor at the end of time, on which they are fixated. And their fixation on this, against any Catholic social teaching, it allows them to very easily negate and ignore the interhuman, the conditions on the ground between actual people, and to not nurture their ability to establish, to develop compassion and care for the other humans around. And I don't want, that's exactly, those dudes. But they shall remain nameless, because they're well-meaning. They're well-meaning, Trevor. I'm not trying to say that they're bad. It's just that they're not educated. They're not.
We should be clear. We should be clear here. What Douglas just said is very important. None of us are trying to say that any of these people are bad. The notion that we're in a situation which is good guys versus bad guys is totally the wrong way of thinking about this. The circumstances have changed, and so therefore the way we approach things have to change. That's all. Exactly.
And we can watch. I mean, we're all wandering around. We're all wandering, blind leading the blind in a certain way. But if those of us who accept the fact that we are blind are now returning to school to develop new faculties through which to see and hear and understand what is going on, there is a humility in this that I trust we are going to engender as we move through this. Our insights are great, but we all have a lot to learn.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug. Next up is Milo. Milo, go ahead.
I come from a background that's pretty used to putting people into good guy and bad guy categories. I started my life studying Russian language to make my parents angry during the Cold War. Spent 8 years doing that, and also served a total of 4 years active duty with the US Marine Corps. These days, however, I've lived outside the United States since 1996, first in the UK, then in Belgium, then in Italy, and now in Warsaw, Poland. But I travel about 300 days a year. And I do that for two reasons. First of all, I teach. A lot of the material generated, frankly, by the center and my colleagues, generous colleagues at the center. I teach in business schools, trying to convince people, mostly in MBA programs, trying to convince people that as the psychotechnological environment changes, people will adopt new values, and new values bring new sources of value. And if your sole goal is to simply succeed in business, it pays attention, or it pays to pay attention and understand the new psychotechnical environment. The other reason I travel some 300 days a year is I'm a visiting research fellow at the Changing Character of War Center at Oxford. And I'm specifically working on a digital net assessment for Poland, trying to understand, insofar as this country is a NATO member on the Eastern European, in Eastern Europe, on the Central European plane. It's sort of a geopolitical canary in the coal mine. If the center is right, and in important ways, digital retrieves the medieval. What does that mean to geopolitics? And then instead of trying to answer that grand question, I thought it was helpful to focus on one country with a relatively clear and distinct identity in a strategically important place, and that's Poland. So I've learned a lot from this group, and I continue to learn a lot, and I hope we can share some of it with some of you who are interested.
Thank you, Milo. Thank you. Next up is Fred. Fred, welcome. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, and sorry to be here so late. I usually don't wear a tie on a Sunday afternoon, but we were celebrating the 130th anniversary of the Extension School at the University of Chicago. And so today was an awards dinner that I was there. But it was fascinating to see because we're celebrating then a radically new idea at the end of the 19th century. And now we're here thinking about how to carry on the university into the 21st century. And one of the things that I think it's very important with that vision of retrieving the medieval is a university is a medieval institution. And that idea of that is it's a form of an international intellectual community that in its essence is not the football team. It's not the student affairs. It's not the administration or the president or the development office. Rather, it's faculty and students. That's the pure form. And that was what it was originally. And I'm part of Trivium University, and I'm excited about this program because it goes back to the roots, back to the idea of what the original institution was about. And so sorry to be coming in right at the end, but I'll be here for the other lectures. And so I know there's Q&A, and so I'll turn it back to Shrikant for Q&A.
Thank you. Mark,
Thanks,
given that we have small amount of time, I want to highlight 3 questions. Would you like to say anything, Mark, in response to Doug, Milo, or Fred?
No, let's go to the Q&A.
Sure.
We're trying to keep this on a schedule.
Yes.
We will have 3 more lectures, and so you'll have many other opportunities.
I want to highlight 3 questions. You can take whichever ones you want. Sharon asks, have these kind of transitions happened in human history before? And how did people handle it at that time? Maxwell House asks, how do you know that rotation of elites has broken down? And what does that mean? So could you elaborate on breaking down of the rotation of elites? And the last one was on what replaces advertising and marketing in this new world? So you can take whichever ones you want.
Well, I'll take the rotation question. And just note here for you that for a variety of reasons in my own studies, I've become something of I guess a minor expert on the Rockefeller family. And the role the Rockefeller family played, for those who have followed this, was an absolutely enormous one for decades. And so there was a classic example here of remember John D. Rockefeller Sr. was run out of Cleveland as a cattle rustler and wound up in the rough town of Chicago and invented public relations in a certain sense to try to rescue the name of the Rockefeller family, and then went on to fund and effectively invent social science in the 20th century. All of this was rotation of the elites. These were not things that the 19th century Victorian robber barons would have thought about. And then it hit the fan. The proposal was to an organization called Bilderberg Group. The proposal was to include, imagine this, Asia in the conversation. And you all know what happened. The Europeans rejected the Rockefellers. They then went and started something called Trilateral Commission, but they had lost it by then. And no one has reconstituted, in my research, a elite in the West to replace the Rockefellers. Very hard to go beyond 3 or 4 generations at the most. And it just didn't happen. We wound up with hundreds of NGOs. We wound up with a real scatterbrained situation. So we have just lived through, for anyone who does a history of the elites in the past 50 years, would notice that we are now operating effectively without an elite. Two other questions are the paradigms.
The first one was, how has mankind handled such paradigm shifts before, and what did that look like? And the last one was on the how advertising and marketing changes in this.
Right. Well, I kind of wish we had Chris Perry to take that last question. I don't know if Milo or Fred want to jump in here. I'd be happy to briefly tackle the paradigms question, if they don't mind.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, we've been through 5 major, as Milo correctly identified it, the full term is psychotechnological. So we're marrying the psychology with the technology paradigms. And the 5 of them, which we will talk about in some detail next week, navigating the paradigms, were oral, scribal, which is to say literacy, but handwritten literacy by scribes, print, and then following that, electric, and now digital. And the conflicts between those in those transitions, each of them have a small library associated with it. So the shift from an oral world to a scribal world has been described by many people, anthropologists and others. But the basic answer to the question was, in going through that transition, the people associated with the previous paradigm, and this became particularly aggressively asserted when we went through the next paradigm shift from scribal to print, that is colonialism. So what happened is that print so much devalued the oral world, which was really not so much the case, at least universally under scribal conditions. Under print conditions, we wound up with imperialism, colonialism, all those nasty things that people talk about today. That was a conflict amongst paradigms. The paradigm shift from electric to electric, rather, from print, we all know about in terms of modern art, which is the reason why McLuhan pointed to artists, and we know that the quantum mechanics versus Newtonian mechanics. And so my answer to your question is, these transitions typically happened over extended periods of time. They involved a lot of personal strife, but they didn't have to, although in some cases did, wind up in very violent reactions. What we're going through now is compressed greatly in time and complicated by the fact that we have 3 spheres, which will be the last of the 4 lectures coming up now in 4 weeks. Not just East and West, which do not think about the world in fundamental terms at all the same, but we have added a new sphere, the digital sphere. And so that brings us into a topic that we will discuss more in the last of the 4 lectures, what we call the 3-body problem, and how there is no solution to it. It's going to have to somehow be reduced in its danger associated with it. And we'll go through that in great detail later on.
Thank you, Mark. Do you want to give a preview of the last 3 lectures, the 3 lectures coming up?
Sure. And I'll just briefly say, we don't know exactly what's going to replace advertising, but we know that consumer economics, as it has been built over the course of our lifetimes, is already unraveling. And so assuming that we will continue to move forward at the levels of consumption that we now have is the wrong assumption. The next 3 lectures, briefly, to preview them, next week, we're going to deal with the question of paradigms. So that was one of the questions today, leading us into how do we navigate this shift? So You're going to again have 4 topics. You're going to have a number of bullet points on all of that. We're going to have another whole long discussion of that. I hope you attend, and I hope you enjoy. And we have been not nearly as interactive as I would like to be. I want to emphasize here that we have to learn a great deal from you. I put up a bunch of songs that my guess is many of the people here have never even heard. I want to learn what the new songs are. I want to learn who the new artists are. I want to learn from you. And so TrivU is going to be a very seminar-oriented, interactive, two-way process. This is not going to be lecturers standing up, although we're doing something like that today. So next week will be navigating paradigms. We'll skip the week after that. We had a scheduling conflict. So 2 weeks after that, we'll have the 3rd lecture. The 3rd lecture will be on the topic of thinking anew, a topic that we have touched upon today, but we will go into much more detail in 3 weeks. And this will be really the distinction between analogical thinking and logical thinking, and how they map into the trivium, specifically into grammar and dialectics, and how we are going to be participating, maybe even a factor in tipping the balance back towards analogy and grammar. The final 4th, which will be 4 weeks from today, that will be a whole discussion of the new geopolitical configuration around 3 spheres. So in summary here, there are 2 things that I would like you to leave this lecture with. First and foremost, we have an enormous amount of material that is not now being taught in today's curriculum that needs to be uncovered, needs to be exposed, discussed, and absorbed. Secondly, we have a remarkable team of people who are ready to do this. This is not an idea that just came up yesterday in the shower. This is actually something we've been working on for a few years now. Everybody who has spoken today has known each other for years, if not decades. We have been collaborating for a long time now, and I hope you will agree. We're now ready to begin to talk expansively in a variety of ways to a wide public. I very much appreciate your time today. I'm looking forward to seeing you again through the course of these lectures. I'm looking forward to seeing many of you also enrolled in Trivium University next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Fred, Doug, and Milo, and everybody. See you next week. Bye.